What was your attitude to Hitler and appeasement in the 30s, Lady Violet?
Oh, it was the most traumatic time in my whole experience. The only good thing it brought me was reunion with Winston. We had, of course, been politically severed when he was in the coalition of 1918-22. You know, that coalition led by Lord George and Bonner, which I regard as the most disreputable government, bar none, we've ever had in this country. Invasion of Russia, which, alas, he promoted. Sale of honours, which, of course, he wouldn't have touched with the tongs. And the Black and Tans in Ireland, over which I had terrible rows with him. Now, during the 20s, Winston was seeing red. He had an absolute fixation about the Bolshevik menace, the menace of communism. He actually went to Italy, where he gave his blessing, you won't believe this, to the fascist government of Mussolini, and said some very nice things about the charm of Mussolini and so on. When he came back and I saw him, I was incensed. I said, how could you say such things about a fascist dictator? I said, you're still seeing red. What you don't seem to realize is that fascism is not an antidote to Bolshevism. They're both poisons, with different labels on the bottle. Oh, no, he said. One stood for patriotism, stability and order. The other stood for subversive forces, chaos and leveling and so on. Anyway, we came to no agreement about that. But this is only to show you that he did not see a menace in Mussolini. It was only when Hitler came to power that he saw I suppose we mustn't call it the red light. And at that moment, I think it was 33, I very fortunately met him at a large country house party at Taplow Court. And I said to him, you're not enjoying this party? We went for a little walk together along the side of the Thames. You're not enjoying this party? He said, well, are you? Look at these people. What are they? They can't see. They don't know. They can't think. And then we are confronted with far more deadly perils than we ever were in 1914. And then he spoke of Hitler, and he saw the answering horror in my eyes. He saw that I, too, recognized Hitler as a monstrous portent who threatened us, Europe, and anything that we may have called civilization. And I said to him, but what are we going to do about it? What action can we take? And he said, oh, what action can one take? I said, well, the only thing that Baldwin could be influenced by is public opinion. He has an absolutely uncanny sense of public opinion, and he responds to it automatically. I mean, he needs no psephologists or Gallup polls to tell him what the people think or want. He's got it in his bones, and he gives it them. Unfortunately, what the people want today is not necessarily what they need. But now you must be the awakener. You must rouse public opinion. You're the only person who can do it. You alone can do it. And I remember his reply, yes, and the trouble is I shall do it alone. I shan't have any press. I've got no springboard. And worst of all, I've got no following. Well, I said, we must recruit a following for you, and we must create a springboard. And it was from this conversation that was born a little group which we formed, you've probably heard of it, called His Focus. He called it His Focus. Focus in defense of freedom and peace. And its battle cry was arms and the government.
And when the Munich Agreement came, how did you react to that?
Oh, with horror and despair. Two scenes seared on my memory during this time, connected with Munich. We met on the day of Munich. Our focus met at luncheon. This was the day when Chamberlain had gone out there to meet the dictators. And we resolved to send a telegram to Chamberlain, signed by some representative members of all parties, adjuring him not to betray the Czechs. Our idea was that it should be signed by Winston, by Anthony Eden, by Lord Cecil, Lord Robert Cecil it was, and by Lord Lloyd on behalf of the Conservatives, Archie Sinclair for the Liberals, and Attlee for Labour. And a few of us, including myself, were given the task of drafting the telegram during the afternoon. We were to meet again, some of us, just a small inner group, at the Savoy at 7 o'clock that evening. Well, we duly did so. And then trouble began. Archie, Lloyd, Cecil, and of course Winston were eager and anxious to sign. Attlee, in spite of Noel Baker's telephonic entreaties to him to do so, which we heard one side of, said that though in complete sympathy with his object, he couldn't do so without the approval of his party, and that they were not meeting for a fortnight, and then at some watering place or other. Until then, he couldn't act. And as for Anthony, he too proved a terrible disappointment to us. He said that he agreed with us too, but if he signed, it would be taken as a sign of hostility to Chamberlain. We didn't feel that the remaining signatures were representative enough to count. And all our friends went out one by one, defeated. Winston remained sitting in his chair, immobile, like a man of stone, with tears in his eyes. Now, I stayed with him, and I made a few notes in my diary the same night of what we said to each other. I'd rather read them, if you don't mind. At last he said, "What are they made of? The day will come when it won't be signatures we'll have to give, but lives, the lives of millions. Can we survive? Do we deserve to do so when there's no courage anywhere?" I said, "There's your courage still. The day will come when people will rise to it, and it will prevail. Your day will come. However fast we run away, we shall be caught at last." Yes, he said, caught at last. Without an ally or a friend, we shall have betrayed them all by then. I, too, was struggling with tears.
What did you do yourself in the war?
Well, I had two jobs which I wouldn't have exchanged with any others. Chamberlain, most typically, such an unimaginative man, thought on the declaration of war that the BBC would be no earthly good to anyone. Actually, as we all know, it was one of our greatest war-winning weapons. He practically abolished it. He scrapped the board, leaving just a chairman and, I think, a treasurer and a secretary. And otherwise, the BBC was more or less to shut up shop. Well, when Winston came, not directly he came, I think it was in 41, there'd been some very lucky fuss or row about a communist piccolo player or someone who'd been turned out of an orchestra. That's what attracted his attention to it. And he reconstructed the board, and to my delight, he put me on it. I remember his letter.
The Board of Governors?
Yes. I remember his letter to me, asked me to serve, and I replied with his own phrase, one sentence, "Can a bloody duck swim?" Because when Baldwin offered him Chancellor of the Exchequership, when he'd been down and out years ago, he thought it was going to be the Chancellor of the Duchy. When Baldwin said, "Would you like to be my Chancellor?" Then it transpired it was the Exchequer. I said to him, "Can a bloody duck swim?" I don't know if he really said those words, but my reply to him was simply, "Can a bloody duck swim?" And afterwards he always called me his bloody duck. I had to sign myself, or BD, and so on.
You enjoyed that?
It was a joke. One of those simple jokes which he enjoyed. He had a very childish enjoyment of jokes, and the oftener they came, the better he liked them. The only time I ever saw Winston really disheartened and depressed in the war was when he came back after the Tehran conference. Not Yalta, Tehran. You remember that he had pneumonia for the second time that year. He had it out in North Africa. And when I found him looking so depressed, so unlike himself, so unresilient, I thought, of course, it was an aftermath of his pneumonia. And I asked whether he was still feeling it. And he said, no, it's not that. It's nothing to do with that. It's Tehran. And I said, but what happened at Tehran? He said, I realized at Tehran for the first time what a small nation we are. He said, there I sat with a great Russian bear on one side of me, with paws outstretched. He did it so dramatically. On the other side, the great American, I think he called him Buffalo. And between the two sat the poor little British donkey, who was the only one of the three who knew the right way home.
What view did you take of the relations between the Conservatives and the Liberals after the 4-5 election?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Of the Conservative rank and file, I don't think that their relations with us were much changed, or indeed changed in any way. But Winston certainly felt the draft of being alone amongst the Tories, whom, as you know, had never taken him to their heart. He loved coalition. He liked the padding of other parties. He didn't want to be left quite tete-a-tete with the Tories. He knew we wouldn't make a coalition with him, but he wanted some sort of understanding, some sort of entente. He wanted to keep some liberal contacts. And he said to me, I don't suppose any of your people would look at coalition, but I do so want us to work together. I do so want you to get into Parliament. I want to have some policy talks with Rab Butler, and see just how far we disagree on major issues. So I said, yes, I should be delighted. My colleagues were very suspicious. But I had many most agreeable and most interesting talks with Rab Butler, whom I liked enormously. I thought him a rather unique character. I'd never had any talks with him before, and had always harbored rather a grudge against him because I'd been on deputations during the appeasement time, and he'd stonewalled, you know, for Chamberlain. He was at the Foreign Office Under-Secretary. And Rab and I clicked and saw everything, same angle. But of course the man who had the seats, and seats were the important things, was Walton. And he never came into the picture at all. So far as any practical entente was concerned, the operation was a washout.
Did you see much of Winston Churchill in the last few years and months of his life?
Oh, yes. I saw him very, very often. Always down at Chartwell. Oh, no, not always down at Chartwell. I also saw him when he came up to Hyde Park Gate. I either lunched with him and spent 3 or 4 hours after lunch playing music or talking, or I had dinner and stayed with him until about midnight. He always went very late to bed. I think I was able to help him to pass these long crawling days a little bit by the fact that, as with many old people, the past was still very vivid to him, whilst the middle distance had dropped away. And I was able to recall to him things which I'd shared with him and which I'd remembered in the past, and which are still as clear as crystal in his memory.
When you look back, what are the main differences you see between politics in the 60s and politics 50 and 60 years ago?
Well, one thing we must remember is that 60 years ago, we hadn't got the mass electorate we've got today. We had a relatively small elite, 90% of whom voted. Then we also had an electoral system which, between 2 parties, operated quite fairly. Now that it operates with 3 parties, it produces wholly unrepresentative and distorted results. It's a game of pitch and toss. That is one great difference.
What about the lines between the parties?
The lines between the parties in old days were strictly ideological. Now, they're dictated by the party machines. I think there are all sorts of mixtures of opinions in all parties. As I think I've already said, I know good liberals in both the other parties. And no doubt, I also know some Tories in the Labour Party. In old days, they used to cross the floor, as Winston did, and many of his friends, for instance, on the free trade protection issue. Well, now they daren't do that. They daren't leave the safe shelter of the party machine and go out into the wilderness. One can see instances of people who've done that. For instance, the people who protested against Suez. People like Anthony Nutting, Under Secretary for the Foreign Office. And Anthony Eden's white-headed boy. He was anti-Suez and brave enough to say so. So was Nigel Nicholson. What's happened to them? They've dropped out of politics altogether.
What about the influence of Parliament?
Well, there again, I think a great change has taken place. I mean, Parliament used to be the great powerhouse, the great source of power. To be in it meant you'd got your hands on some, at least, of the levers of power. In my father's day, I mean, we had big industrialists, like, for instance, Alfred Mond. I dare say he was there for other reasons as well, but he felt it necessary to be there. And we had, of course, trades unionists, J.H. Thomas and John Burns, people like that. They, too, had got to be there to fight their end. But now, what happens? I don't think we've got any representatives, at least none I can think of, or who operate very actively, big industry. And as to Frank Cousins, and this is the supreme example of the loss of power of Parliament, Frank Cousins has walked out of Parliament. He didn't think it worth being there. He thought he could operate more freely and more powerfully outside.
Do you think that developments in science and technology have had an effect on politics?
I think that is an extraordinary, that has produced an extraordinary change in our lives. Because so many things are, I won't say at the mercy of experts. We need experts, but have become the province of experts. Backroom boys, they may be called, and the ordinary citizen can't understand this specialized and esoteric know-how. And I think this is an age when we concentrate more and more on means and less on ends, more and more on processes and less on purposes. And it's a curious paradox that while what's called the march of science, miracles or conjuring tricks of science, gaining these daily, almost hourly victories, conquering the skies, bridging the seas, broadcasting knowledge, defeating pain, almost defeating death. We, men, have not become any more virtuous or any more civilized than we were before. In fact, during my lifetime, I should say that civilization had reeled backwards. If in my childhood or youth I had been told that I should live to see things like concentration camps, torture chambers, forced confessions, gas ovens, I should have dismissed them as a nightmare from which I should soon wake up. I'm often reminded of a story I heard. It was about a distinguished Indian called Sir Bengal Rao. And he was out in the jungle on a hunting expedition in India. And after they'd traveled about, 3 days, the Indian bearers laid down their burdens and refused to go one step further. And Sir Bengal asked them if they were tired. No, they said, we are not the least tired, but we must wait here at least 24 hours until our souls catch up with our bodies. You know, I sometimes wonder whether we ought not perhaps to do the same.